I'm 87 years old, and I need to tell you something before you decide this video isn't for you, because if someone had said this to me when I was younger, my entire life would have unfolded differently, and I don't mean in some dramatic movie way, I mean in the quiet moments that actually matter, the ones you don't realize are shaping you until they're gone, because for most of my life I believed I was doing everything right. I worked hard, I stayed responsible, I showed up when I was supposed to. I followed the rules, and I told myself that meaning would eventually catch up to me, that one day I'd wake up and feel satisfied, at peace, certain that my life made sense, but that day never came the way I expected it to, and the moment that finally shook me didn't come during a crisis or a tragedy or a near-death experience. It came from a simple question, asked quietly, almost casually, and when I heard it, I felt something inside me stop, like time paused just long enough for me to see my life clearly for the first time, because that question forced me to realize how often I had been busy without being present, how often I had confused motion with progress, how often I had postponed what mattered because it felt uncomfortable or inconvenient, and in that moment I understood something that took me 87 years to learn, which is that life doesn't slowly reveal its meaning at the end. It keeps asking you the same question over and over while you're distracted, hoping you'll finally hear it, and most people don't, not until it's too late, and that's why I'm sharing this now, not to give advice, not to tell you how to live, but to offer you the one question that changed how I see everything, because if you let it sink in, really sink in, it might change how you see your time, your choices, and the people in your life long before you reach my age. I'm 87 years old now, and when people hear that number, they usually imagine wisdom arriving neatly with age, as if the years automatically teach you what matters, but the truth is far messier, because most of what I know came late, after mistakes had already taken their toll, after time had already slipped through my hands, and for most of my life I was convinced I understood how things worked, convinced that effort alone was enough, convinced that if you stayed busy and responsible and did what was expected of you, meaning would somehow appear on its own, yet it didn't, not in the way I thought it would, and the moment that finally cracked that illusion open didn't come during a war or a hospital stay or the loss of a friend. It came quietly, through a simple question that stopped me cold and forced me to look at my entire life differently, because until that moment I had been moving forward without ever really asking myself why, measuring success by motion rather than direction, mistaking endurance for purpose, and confusing survival with living. And when you're young you don't notice this because time feels endless and mistakes feel reversible, but as the years stack up, you start to see patterns you wish you'd noticed sooner, conversations you should have had earlier, apologies you delayed too long, and moments you rushed through without realizing they would never come back. And I spent decades believing that tomorrow was guaranteed, that there would always be another chance to say what mattered, another day to slow down, another season to fix what I neglected. Until one day someone asked me a question so simple and so direct that I couldn't dodge it, couldn't intellectualize it, couldn't brush it aside with busyness or humor, and in that instant I felt something shift, like a light turning on in a room I'd been stumbling through for years, because the question wasn't asking about my achievements or my failures, it wasn't asking about money or reputation or accomplishments, it was asking whether any of it had truly mattered to me in the way I assumed it did, and that forced me to confront an uncomfortable truth, which is that much of what I chased so urgently was driven by fear rather than love, fear of falling behind, fear of disappointing others, fear of being seen as ordinary, and fear has a way of keeping you moving while slowly hollowing you out, because it pushes you to prove instead of connect, to accumulate instead of appreciate, to rush instead of feel, and looking back now I can see how often I chose efficiency over presence, productivity over intimacy, and certainty over curiosity, telling myself I would make time later, when things calmed down, when work eased up, when life allowed it, not realizing that life doesn't hand you permission to be present, you have to choose it while everything else is competing for your attention. And the cruel irony is that the moments that end up meaning the most are rarely the ones you plan or prepare for, they're the quiet ones you nearly miss, the conversations that linger longer than expected, the ordinary afternoons that become memories only after they're gone, and I missed more of those than I care to admit, not because I didn't care but because I assumed they would repeat themselves, and they don't, not exactly, because people change, circumstances change, and time quietly edits your life whether you're paying attention or not, and one of the hardest lessons I learned is that intention without attention doesn't count for much, because you can love people deeply in theory and still fail them in practice if you're not fully there, and I thought providing was enough, that showing up physically was the same as being emotionally available, that silence avoided conflict when in reality it just postponed understanding. And the older I got the more I realized that many of my regrets weren't about things I did wrong, but about things I didn't do at all, questions I didn't ask, feelings I didn't express, risks I didn't take because they felt inconvenient or uncomfortable at the time, and that's the danger of waiting for clarity before acting, because clarity often arrives after the opportunity has passed, and what that question did, the one that changed everything, was strip away my excuses and force me to see that life isn't something you solve, it's something you participate in, and participation requires vulnerability, which I avoided for years by staying busy and useful and reliable, because those things are praised and rewarded, while vulnerability feels risky and inefficient. Yet it's the only doorway to real connection, and when you're nearing the end of your life, it's not your efficiency you remember, it's your connections, the people you let see you clearly, the moments you allowed yourself to feel deeply without rushing to the next task. And I wish I had understood sooner that listening is more powerful than advising, that being present is more valuable than being impressive, and that saying, "I don't know," can be an act of honesty rather than weakness, because so much of my life was spent pretending I had answers when what people really needed was my attention, and that question shattered the illusion that I was running out of time to reflect, because reflection without change is just nostalgia, and change requires courage even late in life, maybe especially late in life, because you have to admit that some doors are closed and some choices are irreversible, and still decide to live fully in the time that remains, not with bitterness but with clarity, and clarity has a way of simplifying things, showing you that many of the worries that consumed you were temporary, while the moments you rushed past were permanent in their impact. And if there's one thing age gives you, it's perspective, but perspective only matters if you're willing to let it alter how you live, not just how you remember, and that's what that question gave me, permission to stop performing and start paying attention, to value honesty over harmony, depth over speed, and meaning over momentum. And I don't say this as someone who figured it out early, I say it as someone who learned late and wishes he'd been braver sooner, because life doesn't ask you to be perfect, it asks you to be awake. And being awake means noticing when you're choosing comfort over truth, habit over growth, and fear over love. And if you're younger than me, which you almost certainly are, I won't tell you what to do with your life, but I will tell you this: don't wait for a crisis to ask yourself the questions that matter. Don't assume there will be a better time to slow down and look honestly at where you're headed, because the years pass quietly, and one day you realize you've been answering questions no one ever asked while avoiding the one that could have changed everything. And if my life has taught me anything at all, it's that meaning isn't something you find at the end, it's something you practice along the way, in small choices, in daily attention, and in the courage to stop and ask yourself whether the life you're living actually reflects the values you believe in, because that question, simple as it is, has the power to change everything, if you're willing to answer it truthfully.